It's September the 17th, 2021, and our reading today in 2 Kings is in chapter 10. Now there were in Samaria 70 sons of the house of Ahab, so Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria, to the officials of Jezreel, to the elders, and to the guardians of Ahab's children. He said, "As soon as this letter reaches you, since your master's sons are with you, and you have chariots and horses, a fortified city, and weapons, choose the best and most worthy of your master's sons, and set them on his father's throne. Then fight for your master's house." But they were terrified and said, "If 2 kings could not resist him, how can we?" So the palace administrator, the city governor, the elders, and the guardians sent this message to Jehu: "We are your servants, and we will do anything you say. We will not appoint anyone as king. You do whatever you think best." Then Jehu wrote them a second letter saying, "If you're on my side and will obey me, take the heads of your master's sons and come to me in Jezreel by this time tomorrow." Now the royal princes, 70 of them, were with the leading men of the city who were bringing them up. When the letter arrived, these men took the princes and slaughtered all 70 of them. They put their heads in baskets and sent them to Jehu in Jezreel. When the messenger arrived, he told Jehu, "They brought the heads of the princes." Then Jehu ordered, "Put them in 2 piles at the entrance of the city gate until morning." The next morning Jehu went out. He stood before all the people and said, "You are innocent. It was I who conspired against my master and killed him. But who killed all these? Know then that not a word the Lord has spoken against the house of Ahab will fail. The Lord has done what he promised through his servant Elijah." So Jehu killed everyone in Jezreel who remained of the house of Ahab, as well as all his chief men, his close friends, and his priests, leaving him no survivor. Jehu then set out and went towards Samaria. At Beth Eked of the shepherds, he met some relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and asked, "Who are you?" They said, "We are relatives of Ahaziah, and we've come down to greet the families of the king and of the queen mother." "Take them alive," he ordered. So they took them alive and slaughtered them by the well of Beth Eked, 42 men. He left no survivor. After he left there, he came upon Jehonadab, son of Rechab, who was on his way to meet him. Jehu greeted him and said, "Are you in accord with me as I am with you?" "I am," Jehonadab answered. "If so," said Jehu, "give me your hand." So he did, and Jehu helped him up into the chariot. Jehu said, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." Then he made him ride in his chariot. When Jehu came to Samaria, he killed all who were left there of Ahab's family. He destroyed them according to the word of the Lord spoken to Elijah. Then Jehu brought all the people together and said to them, "Ahab served Baal a little. Jehu will serve him much. Now summon all the prophets of Baal, all his ministers and all his priests. See that no one is missing, because I'm going to hold a great sacrifice for Baal. Anyone who fails to come will no longer live." But Jehu was acting deceptively in order to destroy the ministers of Baal. Jehu said, "Call an assembly in honor of Baal." So they proclaimed it. Then he sent word throughout Israel, and all the ministers of Baal came, not one stayed away. They crowded into the temple of Baal until it was full from one end to the other. And Jehu said to the keeper of the wardrobe, "Bring robes for all the ministers of Baal." So he brought out robes for them. Then Jehu and Jehonadab, son of Rechab, went into the temple of Baal. Jehu said to the ministers of Baal, "Look around and see that no servants of the Lord are here with you, only ministers of Baal." So they went in to make sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had posted 80 men outside with this warning: "If one of you lets any of the men I'm placing in your hands escape, it will be your life for his life." As soon as Jehu had finished making the burnt offering, he ordered the guards and officers, "Go in and kill them. Let no one escape." So they cut them down with the sword. The guards and officers threw the bodies out and then entered the inner shrine of the temple of Baal. They brought the sacred stone out of the temple of Baal and burned it. They demolished the sacred stone of Baal and tore down the temple of Baal. And people have used it for a latrine to this day. So Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel. However, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, the worship and the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. The Lord said to Jehu, "Because you've done well in accomplishing what is right in my eyes and have done to the house of Ahab all I had in mind to do, your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation." Yet Jehu was not careful to keep the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit. In those days, the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel. Hazael overpowered the Israelites throughout their territory, east of the Jordan, in all the land of Gilead, the region of Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh, from Aroah by the Arnon Gorge through Gilead to Bashan. As for the other events of Jehu's reign, all he did and all his achievements, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? Jehu rested with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Jehoahaz, his son, succeeded him as king. The time that Jehu reigned over Israel in Samaria was 28 years. Amen. Well, the story of judgment upon Ahab's family, it continues and it concludes now. This story is terrible and terrifying, of course, but it is also awesome and in a sense wonderful, because it is the judgment of God. Verse 10, the Lord has done what he promised through his servant Elijah. Yes, God is doing it through Jehu and through the means that Jehu will use. But ultimately, this is God fulfilling his word, imposing his justice in this world right now. And it is an awesome thing, but also a wonderful thing when we think about it. Verses 1 to 17, the family of Ahab is wiped out. All 70 of Ahab's direct descendants, 70 sons of the house of Ahab. And verse 7, they're all wiped out. Their heads are cut off, put in a basket and sent to Jehu in Jezreel. Particularly bloody way of doing it. Also in verses 18 to 36, the prophets of Baal are wiped out, and their false religion is destroyed. Jehu's is commended for all of this by God. We mustn't forget this. Verse 30, because you've done well, God is speaking, because you've done well in accomplishing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab all I had in mind to do. Your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation. We should rejoice then that here is a man who has heeded the call of God and obeyed the call of God, even if it involved this terrible process of judgment. In this sense, Jehu, I think, points us to the ultimate faithful king who is the judge, the Lord Jesus Christ himself. But maybe there are some things here in this chapter that trouble us. Not so much the essential act of judgment. I think we must accept that. We must submit to that. We must rejoice in that. I know that can be difficult. But again, going back to verse 10, the Lord has done what he promised through his servant Elijah. It's God doing this. That's why we must think in the way that I've said about all of this. But in verse 11, Jehu not only kills everyone in Jezreel who remained of the house of Ahab, that's what he was called to do, but it says, as well as all his chief men, his close friends, and his priests, leaving him no survivor. Well, those are not really, strictly speaking, the family of Ahab. Did the Lord really ask him to do that? And then there's King Ahaziah. Do you remember how he just happened to be there at the same time that all of this was happening? And do you remember how in the previous chapter he was killed? And now in verse 13, some of his relatives turn up. 42 of them are killed. Did the Lord say he should do this? And then the prophets of Baal, well, of course, they have to be dealt with, and they have to be removed. But there's a whole section here about the particularly bloodthirsty way in which Jehu organizes their destruction. I wonder if Jehu, though he is obedient in the exact way that God asked him to be, destroying, removing the family of Ahab, I wonder if he's getting a bit carried away with all of this. I wonder if the power's going to his head. Is he becoming a bit bloodthirsty? It's interesting, in verse 16, he says, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." This is a man with great zeal, but is it out of control a bit? Remember back in chapter 9, verse 20, the way that he drove his chariot? Jehu's famous for this. He was a wild, mad, furious driver of his chariot. Maybe this points to something in Jehu's character. He's out of control. He has great zeal and passion, but it's intemperate. It's a bit wild. And it is interesting that while he is properly and rightly commended in verse 30, and we must remember that he is the obedient, faithful king up to that point. But in verse 31, it says he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. He was not careful to keep the law of the Lord, the God of Israel. And then verse 32, in those days, the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel. In those days, the Lord begins to bring judgment upon his people by giving power to his enemies who begin to overwhelm them and control them. Yes, we can rejoice, and we should, in the judgment of God. Yes, we can rejoice in God's faithfulness. And we can rejoice in Jehu's faithful obedience to the Lord in this chapter. But I think there's also something to bear in mind here, how easily we can slip and slide away into unfaithfulness. Even zeal for the Lord can become something that is selfish, worldly, out of control. Maybe Jehu began to enjoy this. He began to enjoy being the judge and taking life, and the power had gone to his head. That can always happen. We better be careful. How quickly, how easily we can slip from faithfulness into unfaithfulness. We see it in Jehu. We see it in the Jewish people throughout the Old Testament. It's interesting in Romans 12 and verse 11, it does say, never be lacking in zeal. That's the positive we can learn, I think, from Jehu. But also earlier in chapter 10 and verse 2, speaking about the Jewish people, Paul is speaking. He says, for I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. That's the danger. Let's have zeal, but may it be right, spiritual zeal, based only on what God has told us to do on his holy word. And that will always be then for his glory.